Hello, everyone. Greetings on this beautiful spring day. Wanted to just take a few minutes and as we continue navigating these very unusual times that we are in, and just share with you for a few minutes something I feel like the Lord dropped into my spirit earlier this morning. One of the I think most notable quotes of American history coming from the time of the Revolutionary War was by Patrick Henry, and he made the statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." And understanding that in the context of those times, that was kind of the options, if you will. Live with liberty, and if you can't, then he was willing to die fighting. And while that kind of works, obviously, in the natural, I think spiritually, those are not the two options, if you will. They are not opposing choices. In fact, you really can't have liberty without death. Paul said it this way in Galatians 2:20. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So Paul says, I live, but I live because I am crucified with Christ. So again, from a spiritual perspective, rather than these being sort of opposing things, they really go hand in hand. Spiritually speaking, death is what actually leads to life. Jesus said in Matthew 16:24, he said unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. That's so contrary to our fleshly mindset, the way we live, because from a natural perspective, we work to create, to preserve life, our families, our income, our dreams, our hopes, and yet Jesus says, if you want to save your life, if you want to keep your life, you've got to choose to lose it, but lose it for His sake. That really goes back to what Paul says with being crucified with Christ. The scripture talks about us dying daily. And so liberty, spiritual liberty, true liberty comes from the result of us being crucified with Christ. James 1 and verse 25 talks about the perfect law of liberty. Many times I've thought about this verse, and I don't think law and liberty are two words that you connect very often, because to me, law basically implies restriction, parameters, boundaries, and then liberty is freedom. It's the ability to choose and do what you want to do, and sort of live however you want to live. And so those seem to be, to me, in a lot of ways, opposing concepts. And yet James talks about the law of liberty. And in fact, he says, whoever looks into the law, the perfect law of liberty, and continuing therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deeds. So by following the law of liberty, many of you know me well enough to know that I tend to be a driver that doesn't always abide by the set speed limit. I've never found a speed limit that was high enough for my liking. But at the same time, I value the speed limit because as much as I would like to go faster, a lot of times there's actually some liberty that comes from that law, that posted speed limit. The liberty being the confidence, and I realize there are times this isn't exactly the case, but overall that law provides liberty in the sense of I feel freedom, and I feel for the most part a sense of security in getting out on the highway, because there is a law that is trying at least to give some boundaries to how we are conducting ourselves. And so while yes, law can be in a lot of ways restricting, at the same time true life comes from abiding by the law of God. It's kind of like I think sports as well, and I think especially of my years of playing basketball. And if you're on a legitimate basketball court, it's got sidelines, it's got baselines, it's got a half court line. If you're in an official game, there is what's called the key, where the foul line is, and each of those lines can play a different role in the game, and in particular the sidelines and the baselines, which are at the ends of the court, that sets the boundaries of the court. And it's a similar thing. While I would say there have been times of playing that it would have been to my benefit if the sideline was not there, or at least was a little farther out, or at times where the baseline was kind of too close and stepped on it, and therefore was stepped on it with the basketball, and therefore it was ruled out of bounds. And so while all of that is constricting from one perspective, imagine sort of the chaos and the confusion of trying to play without those. In fact, I've tried to play. Actually, one example is the basketball court out behind the church. It is not lined officially, and so it's not always as easy to determine out of bounds, and it's a little more of an objective decision at times. And so while there is restriction that comes from the boundaries, the rules of the game, the laws of the game, if you will, there's also order that comes. It would be extremely chaotic trying to play a game of basketball, especially an official game of basketball, without those lines there to establish the court. And so again, one perspective that is limiting, it's restricting, but from another perspective, there is liberty that can come from that. There is an extremely important concept for us as believers, and that's the word grace. And we all know that without grace, we wouldn't even be here. And we know that grace is something that we need every single day, and not just a dose a day, but we need it all day long. However, there's kind of been I think a perversion of the idea of grace that's kind of crept its way into Christianity, and that perversion is that grace is, and a term that's kind of been used, is that it's almost a license to sin. Paul talks about, because of the grace and the mercy of God, should I just continue in sin because God will forgive me? And he says, God forbid, because grace is not about a freedom and a liberty to do whatever I want because God doesn't care. In fact, Titus chapter 2 and verse 11 says that the grace of God brings salvation, and he has appeared to all men. And then the next verse, I think, it's a very interesting point to me, because it tells us that grace teaches us that we should deny ungodliness and worldly lusts. We should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. So that really is completely contradictory to this idea that grace just lets us do whatever we want to do, because according to what Paul says here in Titus, it is actually grace, the grace of God, that is our teacher, teaching us to deny ungodliness, worldly lusts, that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Now, I don't know about you, but I am actually very thankful that grace is the teacher. For example, I think judgment could have been the teacher, but the implication of that is judgment is stern, it's harsh, it can be unyielding, and yet it is the grace of God that teaches us. It does teach us, again, to deny ungodliness, worldly lust, live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. But the teacher is patient. The teacher is long-suffering. But again, sort of wrapping this up, the context being that grace, it teaches us these things. It teaches us how we should live, because that is the way to have true liberty. I think in some ways, these last couple of weeks, we are all, if we are allowing it to happen, we're kind of experiencing a dying out in ways perhaps that we haven't before, or maybe there's a focus to it that we haven't had before. And I think part of that is because when we have the liberty to go and do whatever we want to do, one of the pitfalls is we can keep ourselves so busy and so distracted that we don't really face some issues head on. And I think the circumstances, I've heard a couple of references to the idea that one of the things this season has brought out for some is a magnifying of perhaps loneliness. And I know from a natural perspective that can be a very negative thing, but if that's a part of the process of dying that will ultimately lead to liberty, then actually it's an extremely wonderful process. Another thing I think we kind of are learning in these last couple of weeks is or maybe not learning per se, but being reminded of, especially in a very unique way, is what really is valuable in life. I think there's so many things that we have a tendency to put value and place as a priority that under the circumstances we're under right now, we realize they're not nearly as important. And we see things like, first and foremost, our relationship with God. That is emphasized, I believe, more than ever under these circumstances, not just our attendance to a church or participation in a church, but our own personal relationship with God. And I know some of you are single and you're living on your own, and so this is a little bit different for you than those of us that are in a household with people. But for those of us in a household with people, I feel like we're being kind of reminded of the value of the people in our lives over our careers, our possessions, our hobbies, the things that really matter. So I would encourage you, dying, I know from a natural standpoint, carries a very negative context, and it's something we avoid. But if we're going to have true liberty and true life that comes from the Lord, there's got to be a dying. And so I challenge you today that there really is liberty that comes from denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following Him. And that leads, as Jesus promised, to life and life more abundantly. God bless you. It is my prayer not only that the Lord continues to keep you during this time, but I think even more so, it's my prayer that the Lord will continue to work in your life in a unique and significant way during this season. God bless you.